The Confession, January 17, 1946. Nuremberg, Germany. The courtroom smells of old wood and cigarette smoke. Outside, snow falls silently over the ruins of a city that once echoed with marching boots and triumphant speeches. Inside room 600 of the Palace of Justice, a man sits beneath harsh electric lights, his hands trembling slightly as they rest on the polished table before him. Dr. Karl Brandt, once Adolf Hitler's personal physician, once Reich Commissioner for Health and Sanitation, stares at the microphone as though it were a confessional booth. The leather chair creaks as he shifts his weight. In his pocket, folded and refolded until the creases have worn through, is a photograph of himself in an SS uniform standing beside the Führer at Berchtesgaden. That photograph, taken in the summer of 1938, shows a man who believed he was building the future. The man sitting in the courtroom 8 years later knows he helped architect something else entirely. He begins to speak. What follows in the coming months will not merely be testimony. It will be revelation. A surgical incision into the darkest experiment of the 20th century. One that involved not test tubes and laboratory rats, but human beings, stripped of their names, their dignity, their very humanity. The experiments Dr. Brandt will describe, and those that investigators will uncover through mountains of meticulous documentation, because the Nazis, in their bureaucratic obsession, documented everything, will reshape international law, medical ethics, and the world's understanding of what happens when science is unshackled from morality. These experiments did not win the war for Germany, but they changed the war nonetheless, and in ways that would echo far beyond the smoking ruins of the Third Reich. The story begins not in a courtroom, but in the intoxicating early days of National Socialist ambition, when men like Brandt believed they were not monsters, but pioneers. In the years before the war, German medicine stood at the pinnacle of world science. The names were legendary. Koch, Virchow, Ehrlich. German universities trained physicians from every continent. German pharmaceutical companies produced innovations that saved millions. When the National Socialists seized power in 1933, many in the medical establishment saw opportunity rather than danger. Here was a government that spoke of national health, racial vigor, the perfection of the folk. Here were resources, funding, and, most seductively, freedom from the ethical constraints that had always hemmed in the truly ambitious researcher. Dr. Karl Brandt was 30 years old when Hitler appointed him as escort physician in 1934. Tall, blond, clinically intelligent, he embodied the Aryan ideal the regime worshipped. He had trained under the great surgeons, had published papers on traumatic injury and battlefield medicine. He was, by all accounts, a gifted physician. He was also a true believer. When Hitler spoke of creating a 1,000-year Reich built on biological supremacy, Brandt did not hear madness. He heard destiny. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible. First came the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring in 1933, forced sterilization of those deemed genetically unfit. Brandt supported it. This was not cruelty, he told himself, but compassion. Why allow suffering to propagate? Then came Action T4 in 1939, the systematic murder of the mentally ill and physically disabled. Brandt was one of the program's architects. 70,000 German citizens were gassed, injected, or starved to death in institutions across the Reich. The program's headquarters stood at Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, hence the name. The victims were called useless eaters, burdens on the state. Their deaths were called mercy. Brandt signed the orders. He visited the facilities. He listened to the reports of how efficiently the carbon monoxide chambers worked, how the bodies were disposed of, how the families were notified with fabricated causes of death. And still, he slept at night. Still, he looked in the mirror and saw a healer. This was the crucible in which the wartime experiments were forged, not in sudden brutality, but in gradual moral erosion, in the slow acceptance of the unacceptable, in the redefinition of human life itself into categories of worthy and worthless. When the war began in September 1939, the machinery was already in place. All that remained was to expand its scope. They came from Dachau first, then Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, Ravensbrück, Auschwitz. The prisoners arrived in trucks, bewildered, terrified, still clinging to the desperate hope that work camps meant survival. The doctors who received them, trained physicians with degrees from prestigious universities, saw not people but material. Research subjects, experimental units. The language itself was a kind of anesthesia, numbing the conscience through abstraction. The experiments fell into categories, each justified by military necessity, each approved at the highest levels of the SS Medical Corps and the Luftwaffe, sometimes by Reichsfuhrer Himmler himself, sometimes with Hitler's knowledge. High-altitude experiments at Dachau, conducted by Dr. Sigmund Rascher, beginning in 1942. The Luftwaffe wanted to know how pilots would respond to sudden decompression at extreme altitudes, what happened to the human body above 40,000 feet, how long a pilot could survive if he had to bail out at the edge of the stratosphere. So they built a low-pressure chamber, sealed prisoners inside, and pumped out the air while cameras recorded every convulsion, every hemorrhage, every moment of the agonizing death that came when lungs collapsed and blood vessels exploded. 80 prisoners died in these experiments. Rascher documented their final moments with clinical precision. In one report, he noted that a prisoner remained conscious until the simulated altitude reached 29,000 feet, at which point violent head movements began, followed by unconsciousness and death. The subject, according to Rascher's notes, displayed severe cyanosis and foam appeared at the mouth. The Luftwaffe was very interested in the results. Freezing experiments also at Dachau, also supervised by Rascher. German pilots shot down over the North Atlantic were dying of hypothermia before rescue could arrive. The Luftwaffe wanted data on cold water survival, on rewarming techniques, on how long a human being could remain viable in near-freezing conditions. Prisoners were stripped naked and immersed in tanks of ice water, sometimes for hours, while researchers monitored their core body temperature, their neurological responses, their heart rates, as those rates slowed, stopped. Some were left outside in sub-zero winter nights, naked, sprayed with water until they froze solid. The rewarming experiments were, if possible, even more sadistic. Some prisoners were placed in scalding baths. Others were forced into close contact with naked women, prostitutes brought from Ravensbrück, to test whether body heat transfer could reverse hypothermia. Approximately 90 prisoners died. The data was meticulously recorded, organized into tables and graphs, and presented at medical conferences. German military physicians praised the research as invaluable. Malaria experiments at Dachau, conducted by Dr. Klaus Schilling. The Wehrmacht was fighting in malarial regions of North Africa and Southern Europe. Schilling, a tropical medicine specialist once renowned for his work on parasitology, infected more than 1,200 prisoners with malaria through mosquito bites and direct blood injection. He tested various treatments, observed the disease's progression, allowed some prisoners to die untreated so he could study the natural course of the infection. Schilling kept detailed notes on symptoms, fever curves, mortality rates. 300 prisoners died. Many survivors suffered permanent neurological damage. Schilling considered it his patriotic duty. Seawater experiments at Dachau, summer of 1944. Luftwaffe pilots forced to bail out over the Mediterranean needed to know if drinking seawater could sustain life, or if chemical additives could make it potable. Dr. Wilhelm Beigelbuch selected 40 prisoners, most of them Roma, considered subhuman by Nazi racial ideology, and divided them into groups. Some received no water, some received only seawater, some received chemically treated seawater. For up to 12 days, these men endured unimaginable thirst. They licked moisture from floors. They begged for water. Their kidneys failed. Their skin turned leathery. Some suffered seizures. Guards reported that prisoners tried to lick freshly mopped floors to capture any trace of moisture. Beigelbuch recorded their suffering in meticulous detail. The chemical, Treatment, he concluded, did not work. Then there were the sulfanilamide experiments at Ravensbrück, the only major concentration camp for women. German soldiers on the Eastern Front were dying of bacterial infections caused by battlefield wounds, particularly gas gangrene. Penicillin was an Allied weapon. Germany needed its own solution. Dr. Karl Gebhardt, personal physician to Heinrich Himmler, directed experiments in which female prisoners had their legs deliberately cut open, the wounds infected with bacteria, dirt, and wood shavings driven into the tissue to simulate battlefield conditions. Then various sulfanilamide compounds were tested to see which could prevent or cure the infections. Dozens of women died of sepsis and gangrene. Others survived with permanent disabilities, their legs scarred and twisted. The women subjected to these experiments, mostly Polish political prisoners, called themselves Konnichin. Rabbits, because they were treated as laboratory animals. Some of the rabbits would survive to testify at Nuremberg. Their testimony would make hardened prosecutors weep. What the doctors expected was glory. They expected that their research would turn the tide of the war, that their willingness to cross ethical boundaries would yield medical breakthroughs impossible for the squeamish Allies. They expected that history would remember them as visionaries who did what was necessary, who understood that in total war, sentiment was a luxury the Reich could not afford. They expected medals, prestigious appointments, gratitude from a victorious Führer. What they received instead was the slow, dawning horror of realization as the Reich collapsed around them. By 1944, the tide had turned irrevocably. The Wehrmacht was retreating on all fronts. Allied bombers reduced German cities to rubble. The camps were beginning to empty as the SS frantically tried to destroy evidence, marching prisoners westward in death columns, burning documents, executing witnesses. The doctors who had conducted the experiments began to understand that the protection they had enjoyed, the protection of a totalitarian state that valued their work, was evaporating. Some, like Rascher, were arrested by the SS itself on charges of unrelated crimes and executed. Others fled westward, hoping to disappear into the chaos of defeat. Still others, like Brandt, clung to the delusion that they would be judged by their intentions, not their actions. They were wrong. When the Allied forces liberated the camps in 1945, Buchenwald in April, Dachau in April, Ravensbrück in April, Auschwitz already in January, the evidence was overwhelming. The Americans, British, and Soviets found not only the survivors, walking skeletons with prison numbers tattooed on their arms, but the documents, filing cabinets full of reports, photographs, experimental protocols. The Nazis' compulsive bureaucracy had preserved everything. There were charts showing survival times in ice water, tables comparing mortality rates between different malaria strains, photographs of wounds deliberately inflicted and left to fester. There were letters from Himmler authorizing experiments, requisition forms for laboratory equipment, invoices for Zyklon B gas. The world saw and the world recoiled. One object appears again and again in the testimony at Nuremberg, in the documents seized from the camps, in the nightmares of those who survived: the syringe. Chrome and glass, elegant in its simplicity, it became the symbol of everything the experiments represented. Medical knowledge perverted, the healer's instrument transformed into a weapon. The syringe that injected malaria parasites into healthy blood. The syringe that administered experimental drugs, poisons, lethal doses designed to test the threshold between treatment and murder. The syringe that drew blood samples from dying prisoners so that their final physiological data could be recorded. In the hands of a true physician, a syringe saves lives. It delivers insulin to the diabetic, morphine to the suffering, vaccines to the vulnerable. It represents the covenant between doctor and patient, the promise to do no harm. In the hands of the Nazi doctors, it became an instrument of torture, a symbol of the ultimate betrayal. When prisoners saw a doctor approaching with a syringe, they knew they were not about to be healed. They knew they were about to become Data. One survivor, a Polish woman who endured the sulfanilamide experiments at Ravensbrück, testified that the sight of a syringe made her physically ill for the rest of her life. She could not receive vaccinations. She could not donate blood. The simple medical instrument had been transformed in her mind into the emblem of evil. This was perhaps the deepest wound the experiments inflicted. Not just the physical suffering, not just the deaths, but the corruption of medicine itself, the poisoning of the relationship between healer and patient. The Nazi doctors destroyed something fundamental: trust in the white coat, trust in the medical oath, trust in the very idea that science serves humanity. The Nuremberg doctors' trial began on December 9, 1946, 4 months after the main war crimes tribunal concluded. 23 defendants sat in the dock, 20 of them physicians, 3 of them Nazi administrators. The chief prosecutors were American, led by Brigadier General Telford Taylor, who had served as counsel in the main Nuremberg trials. The evidence they presented was so horrific that even judges who had spent years prosecuting Nazi atrocities found themselves shaken. Dr. Karl Brandt sat in the front row of defendants, still maintaining his dignity, still insisting that everything he had done was medically justified, legally authorized, and necessary for the war effort. He could not understand why the Allies failed to recognize this. He pointed out that the Allies themselves had conducted radiation experiments, had tested chemical weapons, had pushed the boundaries of ethical research. Why was he being singled out? Why was German science on trial when Allied science had done similar things? But the prosecutors had an answer, and it was found in the mountains of evidence, in the testimony of survivors, in the photographs that showed not just medical experiments, but torture, not research, but murder. The distinction was not subtle. Allied researchers tested experimental treatments on volunteers, on soldiers who understood the risks. They tested drugs on animals before humans. They stopped experiments when harm became apparent. The Nazi doctors had done none of these things. They had treated human beings, unwilling, uncomprehending, legally powerless human beings, as disposable tools. They had conducted experiments that had no possible therapeutic benefit to the subject. Experiments designed only to gather data, no matter the cost in suffering. The prosecution introduced the testimony of survivors. The Polish women from Ravensbrück described how they were held down while doctors cut into their legs, how they screamed in pain as bacteria and debris were packed into their wounds, how they watched their fellow rabbits die of infections that could have been prevented with basic antibiotics. The survivors of the freezing experiments described the agony of ice water, the humiliation of forced nudity, the betrayal of watching men in white coats take notes while prisoners begged for mercy. And then there were the documents. Dr. Rascher's reports to Himmler, written in the detached language of science. The third experimental series was concerned with freezing experiments in ice water. The lowest body temperature until loss of consciousness was 27.7 degrees Celsius. Another report described a prisoner's death in the low-pressure chamber. After relative recuperation from the parachute descending test, a third experiment was carried out on this experimental subject. This time, he was not wearing a parachute. The subject began to perspire and wiggle his head. Later, the subject lost consciousness. Breathing ceased, and the electrocardiogram showed that the heart was still working. The judges read these documents in silence. Some covered their mouths. One requested a recess. The defense argued that the experiments were legal under German law, that the prisoners were condemned criminals who had forfeited their rights, that military necessity justified extreme measures, that the researchers had been following orders from the highest levels of government. Dr. Brandt's attorney argued that his client was a dedicated physician who had acted in good faith, believing he was serving his country and advancing medical knowledge. The tribunal was unmoved. On August 20, 1947, after 139 days of testimony, the verdicts were read. 7 defendants were sentenced to death by hanging, including Dr. Karl Brandt, Dr. Karl Gebhardt, Dr. Waldemar Hoven, Dr. Joachim Mrugowski, and Dr. Victor Brack. 9 received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life. 7 were acquitted, though several would later face prosecution in other countries. On June 2, 1948, at Landsberg prison, the death sentences were carried out. Karl Brandt, who had once stood beside Adolf Hitler and believed he was building a better world, walked to the gallows maintaining his innocence to the end. His last words were a defiant assertion that he had served only Germany and medical science. The trapdoor opened. The rope snapped taut. The man who had ordered the deaths of thousands in the name of healing was dead. But the trial's importance extended far beyond the punishment of individual criminals. In the course of the proceedings, the judges recognized that international law had no clear framework for medical ethics, no established standard by which to judge what constituted permissible human experimentation. The Hippocratic Oath was thousands of years old, but it was vague, aspirational, not legally binding. Medical ethics varied by country, by institution, by individual conscience. The Nazis had exploited this ambiguity, had argued that their experiments violated no established international standard. So the tribunal created one. In their judgment, the judges articulated 10 principles that would govern all future human experimentation. These principles, which came to be known as the Nuremberg Code, were revolutionary. They established that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. No experiments could be conducted on prisoners, on the mentally ill, on anyone unable to freely consent. The subject must have the legal capacity to give consent, must be free from coercion, and must have sufficient knowledge to make an informed decision. The experiment must be designed to yield results for the good of society that cannot be obtained by other means. Research conducted purely for curiosity or for military advantage without therapeutic benefit was forbidden. The experiment must be based on prior animal experimentation and knowledge of the natural history of the disease. Human testing must be the last resort, not the first. All unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury must be avoided. The principle of do no harm was reinstated as fundamental. No experiment should be conducted where there is reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur. The Nazi experiments had violated this principle so blatantly that the judges felt compelled to make it explicit. The degree of risk should never exceed the humanitarian importance of the problem. The potential benefit must outweigh the danger. Proper preparations must be made to protect the subject against even remote possibilities of injury or death. Safety protocols were not optional. Only scientifically qualified persons should conduct experiments. The right to conduct research was not unlimited. It came with professional obligations. The subject must be free to end the experiment at any time. The power dynamic between researcher and subject must allow for the subject's autonomy. The scientist must be prepared to end the experiment if there is probable cause to believe it may result in injury or death. Professional responsibility superseded research objectives. These 10 principles, derived directly from the horror of what happened when they were absent, became the foundation of modern medical ethics. They were incorporated into the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, which further refined the standards for human research. They influenced the Belmont Report in 1979, which established the ethical framework for research in the United States. They shaped national and international laws governing clinical trials, pharmaceutical testing, and medical research across the globe. Every informed consent form signed by a medical research subject today, every institutional review board that evaluates experimental protocols, every ethical guideline that protects patients from exploitation, all of them trace their lineage back to Nuremberg, back to the moment when the world looked at what had been done in the name of science and said, never again. The experiments changed the war in ways their architects never intended. They did not produce the miracle weapons or medical breakthroughs that would save the Reich. The data from the hypothermia experiments proved largely useless because the conditions were so extreme and the methodology so flawed that the results could not be generalized to real-world scenarios. The malaria research yielded no significant advances over existing treatments. The seawater experiments confirmed what was already known. that drinking seawater accelerates death from dehydration. The sulfanilamide tests were superseded by penicillin, which the Allies had perfected and which proved far more effective. But the experiments did change the war by revealing the true nature of the Nazi regime, by providing incontrovertible evidence that the Holocaust was not an aberration, but the logical conclusion of an ideology that divided humanity into categories of worthy and worthless. The experiments showed that the final solution was not merely a product of wartime hysteria or Hitler's personal madness, but a systematic program embraced by educated professionals, by scientists and doctors, by men who should have known better and who did know better but chose evil anyway. When the Allies liberated the camps and found the evidence of the experiments, it galvanized public opinion in a way that reports of battlefield atrocities had not. Soldiers could be brutal. War was brutal. But doctors were supposed to be different. They were supposed to save lives, not take them. The revelation that physicians, members of a profession defined by its ethical obligations, had tortured and murdered prisoners in the name of research shattered any remaining illusion that the Nazi regime was merely another authoritarian government. It exposed the regime as fundamentally, irredeemably evil. This knowledge stiffened Allied resolve in the final months of the war. It justified the demand for unconditional surrender. It ensured that there would be no negotiated peace, no settlement that would allow Nazi leaders to escape justice. The experiments made certain that when the Reich finally fell, its leaders would be held accountable not just for waging aggressive war, but for crimes against humanity itself. In the decades since Nuremberg, the experiments have continued to provoke ethical debates. Researchers have occasionally argued that the data collected, at such terrible human cost, should be used to save lives, that refusing to use it would mean the victims suffered for nothing. Others have argued that using the data would validate the experiments, would suggest that the ends justified the means, would honor the perpetrators rather than the victims. The debate came to a head in the 1980s when a researcher named Robert Pozos sought to use the hypothermia data from Dachau in his work on cold water survival. He argued that the information could save the lives of people suffering from accidental hypothermia, that the data was scientifically valid despite its horrific origin. The proposal ignited fierce controversy. Survivors' groups protested. Medical ethicists argued that using the data would violate the Nuremberg Code's principle that research must not involve unnecessary suffering. The New England Journal of Medicine published articles debating the question. Ultimately, most of the medical community concluded that the data should not be used, not because it lacked scientific merit, some of it was methodologically sound, but because using it would send a message that the experiments, while regrettable, had value. It would suggest that there are circumstances in which the ends justify the means, that sufficient scientific benefit could excuse any atrocity. This was precisely the logic that had enabled the experiments in the first place. The data remains in archives accessible to historians but untouched by medical researchers. It stands as testimony to what was done, but it will not contribute to medical progress. The victim's suffering will not be posthumously transformed into scientific advancement. Some wounds should not be redeemed. Some knowledge is not worth having at any price. The photograph that Dr. Karl Brandt carried in his pocket, the image of himself in SS uniform standing beside Hitler at Berchtesgaden, was found among his possessions after his execution. In it, he looks proud, confident, certain of his place in history. He could not have imagined in that summer of 1938 that less than a decade later he would hang for crimes that the world had not yet named, that his name would become synonymous with the perversion of medicine, that his legacy would be not the advances he sought, but the ethical codes created to prevent anyone from ever doing what he had done. His transformation from healer to war criminal was not sudden. It was incremental, a series of small compromises and rationalizations. It began with the belief that some lives were worth more than others, that the collective good justified individual sacrifice, that science could be divorced from morality. It progressed through the acceptance of forced sterilization, then euthanasia, Then experimentation, each step justified by the previous one, each boundary crossed making the next boundary easier to violate. This is perhaps the most terrifying lesson of the Nazi medical experiments. They were not conducted by sadists or madmen, but by educated professionals who convinced themselves they were doing something noble. They were not the acts of a few rogue criminals, but the product of a systematic program endorsed by institutions, universities, the military, and the state. The doctors who committed these atrocities were not monsters in human form. They were humans who became monstrous through ideology, ambition, and moral blindness. This is why the experiments continue to matter, why they are studied in medical schools and ethics classes, why the Nuremberg Code remains foundational. Because the capacity for this evil does not reside only in Nazi Germany. It resides in any system that places abstract goals above individual dignity, that treats human beings as means rather than ends, that allows expediency to override morality. Today, nearly 8 decades after the liberation of the camps, survivors of the experiments are nearly gone. The last of the Ravensbrück rabbits passed away in recent years. The medical students who will treat tomorrow's patients were not born when the verdicts at Nuremberg were read. The world has moved on, as the world always does. But in every hospital where informed consent forms are signed, in every research protocol that must pass ethical review, in every medical student who recites a modern version of the Hippocratic Oath, the shadow of those experiments remains. They changed the war by changing what came after, by forcing humanity to confront the question of what we owe to one another. What limits must constrain even the pursuit of knowledge? What lines cannot be crossed no matter the justification? The syringe still saves lives. In the hands of ethical physicians, it remains an instrument of healing, a symbol of medicine's power to relieve suffering. But it carries a memory now, a warning. It reminds us that the tools of healing can become weapons, that science without conscience is dangerous, that the oath to do no harm must be absolute. On a winter afternoon in Nuremberg, Dr. Karl Brandt sat beneath harsh lights and began to speak. He thought he was defending himself. Instead, he was revealing the depths to which medicine could fall, the horror that results when healing becomes killing, when research becomes torture, when doctors forget that their first duty is not to the state, not to science, not to progress, but to the human being who trusts them with their life. The experiments did not win the war. They did not advance medicine. They did not build the 1,000-year Reich, but they did teach us something invaluable, that ethics are not luxuries to be discarded in times of crisis, but foundations that must hold precisely when they are most tested. That human dignity is not negotiable, that some knowledge is not worth having if it costs our humanity to obtain it. In the end, the Nazi medical experiments changed the war by changing us, by forcing us to define, in legally binding terms, what it means to be ethical, what it means to be a doctor, what it means to be human. The snow still falls on Nuremberg. The courtroom is now a museum. The documents remain in archives, testimonies to what happened when science served evil. And somewhere in every medical school, a professor stands before a new class of students and tells them about the Nuremberg Code, about the 10 principles that arose from the ashes of atrocity, about the doctors who forgot their oath and the millions who paid the price. The lesson is taught. The warning is given. The next generation takes the oath, promising to do no harm, and the memory of those who suffered endures, a light against the darkness, a reminder that medicine's greatest power is not in its instruments or its knowledge, but in its commitment to healing, to dignity, to the irreducible value of every human life. This is what the experiments revealed. This is what they changed. This is why, 80 years later, we still remember, still teach, still swear that we will never forget. Never again.